My name is Rachel, 38 years old, and I am currently living here in Chicago. The story I will share now is about a terrifying experience I had in a secluded area of Illinois. Originally, I ended up there from Chicago because of a man who became my boyfriend, whom I will call Lucas. "Help me! Help me!" came successive screams and pleas of a pregnant woman while she was being devoured by a ghoul. At that time, I was watching a show on TV. Moments later, the television screen started to blur because a strong gust of wind suddenly blew. We only had an antenna back then, so whenever the wind was strong or the rain was heavy, the TV screen would blur. Instead of continuing to watch a horror show on TV, I decided to just turn it off and thought of buying something for dinner from a nearby store since it was getting late. While I was in the middle of walking, I noticed someone following me. I could really sense that this person was trailing me because every time I glanced over my shoulder, I would see that same man stop and look around, pretending to be searching for something. I couldn't clearly see his face because he was wearing a black jacket, black pants, and a black hat. His hands were hidden behind his back, as if he was pulling out something from there. Overcome with fear, I ran toward a small store where some people were gathered. It was my mother's advice that if I was ever in danger, I should run to a place with lots of people. But before I could reach that group, the man grabbed my left arm and yanked me toward him, causing me to slam into his chest. As I looked up at his face, I realized it was Lucas, my boyfriend. "Are you trying to kill me, Lucas? That's heartbreak right there," I shouted. He just smiled at me, so I responded by hitting him repeatedly. Then he pulled his hidden hand from behind his back, and I saw he was holding flowers. He gave them to me, and my anger instantly faded. Lucas was employed as a caretaker by a wealthy neighbor in our area. He came from rural Illinois and ended up here for work. We started dating because we often ran into each other. In a moment of recklessness, something happened between us. We both gave in to temptation, and a few months later, I learned I was pregnant. In a streak of bad luck, he got fired from his job because he had been too focused on me instead of his work. He also didn't want to live in our family home because he felt embarrassed in front of my parents. He decided to return to his province in Illinois and invited me to come along. I immediately agreed, even though my parents were against it. While on the bus, I couldn't help but marvel at the scenery. So peaceful, unlike Chicago, where houses are crammed tightly together. In that part of Illinois, instead of houses, large trees seemed to crowd the landscape. When Lucas and I got off the bus, we hopped on a small local taxi. As the ride continued, the houses became fewer and farther apart. It was also noticeable how strangely some of the locals stared at me, as if they'd never seen a Chicago girl before. My stomach hurt from the bumpy taxi ride because the roads there weren't smooth. They were rough and rocky. Since the taxi couldn't go down the narrow path leading into Lucas's village, we walked the rest of the way. I was overjoyed when we finally arrived. Lucas immediately introduced me to his relatives, especially his parents. Their simple house wasn't fancy at all, but his parents were very kind. Honestly, it was easy to get along with them, as well as with his siblings. However, what I disliked was that they were always busy, so I often ended up alone at home. Every day, his parents and his two brothers would work on their farm. Sometimes they wouldn't come back at night and would instead sleep in a small hut they owned near the farm, which was far away. I wanted to help, but they insisted I shouldn't exert myself because I was pregnant. Lucas was also often away because he was now driving a small local taxi he had bought, using the money he saved while working in Chicago. That meant I was left all alone most of the time, as the nearest neighbor's house was a good distance away. Rachel, I'm heading out. I need to start early so I can earn something today. By the way, Mom and Dad said they might not come home tonight because they have a lot to finish on the farm. Take care here and don't let anyone in if you don't know them, okay? Lucas reminded me. I nodded in agreement and watched him walk away as I stood by the door. To keep myself occupied, I thought about planting some flowers in the yard. While I was planting, an older woman passed by and started talking to me. I've always been friendly, so I quickly warmed up to her. She told me she lived nearby. Since I didn't really know the place, I believed her. "Are you all alone here? Where are the rest of your folks?" she asked. I answered truthfully. Once she confirmed that I was indeed alone, a chilling grin appeared on her face, revealing her ghastly, dirty, and decaying teeth. It was obvious she didn't take care of them. Even though her appearance was quite unkempt, I didn't feel the need to avoid her. She treated me kindly. Later, she invited me to come to her house, so I would have someone to talk to. "Maybe you'd like to come over to my place? It's just a bit further along. There's not much going on here and you don't have anyone to talk to," she said. But I refused her invitation. When I declined, she didn't force me. She simply said goodbye and went on her way. The sun slowly went down, but Lucas still hadn't returned. Fear started creeping in because I only had a single lamp for light. There was no electricity in Lucas's home. Eventually, night fell. I locked the doors and windows. It was deathly quiet. All I could hear were the crickets outside. Then the silence was broken by a woman's voice coming from outside the house. I felt conflicted about opening the door, and as I listened more closely, I realized it was the older woman I had spoken to before. "I brought some dinner for you. Do you have anyone with you in there?" she called out. Upon hearing that it was her, I went up to the small bedroom, lamp in hand, and slightly opened the window. Indeed, I saw the same woman from earlier. She was standing outside. "I brought some food for you. Do you have anyone in there with you?" she repeated. When I confirmed it was just her, I went downstairs, shut the window, and opened the door for her. I couldn't exactly get the dish from her through the window, so I had to let her in. Once inside, I closed the door again. I transferred the food she brought into another container, and we had a little chat. The timing was perfect since I hadn't eaten dinner yet. I was waiting for my husband to come back from driving his taxi. She asked me once again to go to her house, saying I'd meet more people I could talk to, so I wouldn't be bored. I refused, just like before. While we were talking, there was a sudden thunderous knock on the door, so loud it almost made my soul leave my body. "Rachel, it's Lucas! Open the door!" When I heard my husband's voice, I left the older woman at the table and opened the door. I was so relieved Lucas had come home safely. I was about to introduce him to the older woman, but when I looked at the table, she was gone. All that remained was a black cat sitting on top of the table. I was shocked and confused. Was I just imagining things, or was it simply my hunger? "Why is there a black cat in here?" Lucas asked, puzzled. I couldn't speak right then. I was just as surprised to see a cat when, moments ago, there had been an older woman. Lucas shooed the cat away and it ran out the door. I looked under the table to see if the woman was hiding there, but she wasn't. I had no memory of her leaving the house. "What are you looking for?" Lucas asked, because I still seemed unsettled. "Oh, nothing. Let's just eat," I replied, still confused. But I decided not to tell him what was on my mind. I realized it was pointless. After all, the meal she'd brought was still on the table. Lucas devoured the dish, assuming I had cooked it. I left him to his dinner and went back upstairs to check out the window to see if the older woman was still outside. I was stunned when I saw her standing in the distance, glaring ominously in my direction. Moments later, she vanished into the darkness of the night. The next day, the same thing happened. Lucas left, and I was alone again. The older woman returned, and I immediately asked how she managed to leave my house last night without me noticing. She said she slipped out the back door because she got scared by my husband's voice. Since I'm gullible, I believed her. Over time, we grew even closer, eventually learning each other's names. She told me her name was Lisa. Again, she invited me to her place, saying it was close by. This time, I agreed. I trusted her and followed her wherever she went, because I was unfamiliar with the area. After all, I'd only been there for a week. But hours passed, and we still hadn't arrived at her place. We trekked through thick woods, crossed rivers, and yet still no sign of her so-called nearby house. Along the way, I tore off pieces of leaves or branches as markers, a method Lucas had shown me so I wouldn't get lost, giving myself a trail to follow back if needed. Eventually, we arrived at a remote cluster of houses. The atmosphere there was unsettling. Whether it was children or adults, everyone stared at me as if they wanted to devour me. Lisa said it was normal for the folks there to stare like that, especially if you were new to their area. I started to feel fear rising within me, thinking I wouldn't be able to find my way home because we had come so far. I asked Lisa to take me back before nightfall, and thankfully, she agreed to my request. "Rachel, aren't you pregnant?" Lisa asked unexpectedly. I was shocked she knew, but I admitted the truth. Soon, we reached what she claimed was her house. Her family greeted us, and they all looked ravenous. Their eyes glowed with a strange hunger, and they wouldn't stop staring at me. Even though they seemed bizarre, I decided to lie down and rest in Lisa's room because I was exhausted from pregnancy. I fell asleep without realizing how much time had passed. I awoke to a sharp pain in my belly. I shot upright and saw Lisa's family gathered around me, placing me on a long wooden table. I asked them what they were doing to me. Then I screamed, "Ghouls!" when I saw their features distort. They looked like monsters. I saw Lisa transform, and at that moment I was sure they were some sort of flesh-eating creatures. I recalled how pregnant women were their favorite prey. Terrified, I broke free and ran out of Lisa's house. No idea where to go. Her family grinned while watching me, drooling and growling. I couldn't believe that such ghouls existed outside of mere TV shows. I searched desperately for someplace safe. Eventually, I saw a group of people gathered. I ran over, hoping for help. But what I found was them surrounding the body of a person they were devouring together. I almost retched at the sight. Horrified, I stepped back. I had hoped approaching a crowd might be safe, but not in a cluster of ghouls. In Chicago, people scramble for gossip. In this part of Illinois, ghouls scramble for human flesh. When some of them noticed me approaching, they turned to look at me. In a panic, I pretended to be one of them. I pushed through the crowd and acted like I was also feasting on the body. I smeared the victim's blood on myself, so Lisa's family wouldn't recognize me. That way, the overpowering smell of blood could mask the scent of my unborn baby. At that time, I was only about a month pregnant, so my stomach wasn't very big yet. The ghouls assumed I was one of them, so they didn't attack me. I forced myself to bite into the raw human flesh, even though my stomach churned. I picked up the severed arm of the corpse and slowly moved away from the group. I pretended to chew, but did not actually swallow. Many of them kept glaring at me, as if suspicious, but I held my composure. Arm in hand, I ran as fast as I could away from them, but they chased me. Unfortunately, I tripped on a tree root in the darkness. Even though the moon was bright, my panic made me slip. 3 ghouls pounced on me, clawing at each other as they fought for me. They all wanted to be the first to get me. At that point, I thought I was done for, but it turned out they were more interested in the severed arm I was carrying. Realizing that was what they wanted, I threw the arm far away. They scrambled after it, leaving me a chance to escape. I ran into the woods we had passed earlier. Thanks to the moonlight, I could see the torn leaves I had dropped before. I crossed the same river. Then, in the middle of my escape, I came upon Lisa blocking my path.
"You can't fool me, Rachel,"
she growled, baring fangs like a wild beast. Her glare was murderous, as if she was about to tear me apart. Suddenly, she collapsed to the ground. Lucas had struck her from behind with a heavy blade, repeatedly. "Lucas, how did you know I was here?" I asked as he grabbed my arm and we ran. "I found the note you left on the table," he replied. I remembered I had left him a note before going with Lisa, a habit I'd formed so Lucas wouldn't worry. I asked him how he tracked me through the woods. He said a local woodcutter had seen me enter the forest with a strange woman. The woodcutter witnessed us heading into the trees, so Lucas took a chance on that path. By doing so, he managed to rescue me and lead me away from that village of ghouls. Apparently, for years there had been stories of ghouls in the area, but the so-called ghoul village was really just an isolated community. No one had ever proven they killed people or left evidence behind. Yet, after what I experienced, Lucas and I decided to return to Chicago. The trauma was just too intense, and so ends my story. I hope it serves as a lesson never to trust strangers too easily, as it could put you in danger. It was the evening before the festival when my mom told me to go buy pork and innards so we could prepare some dishes, specifically a recipe similar to a chili made with chopped pork. Since we didn't have our own pig, we decided just to buy meat from the market. It was nearly dusk when I arrived at the local butcher shop, and I was fortunate enough to catch some vendors still open for business. After purchasing what we needed, I happily hurried home since our house is quite far. Fresh blood was still dripping from the meat, even though it was wrapped in plastic. Halfway through my walk, I felt as though something was following me. I glanced around but saw no one. All I could make out were a few run-down, abandoned houses along the road. In that moment, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. Even so, I kept walking, though I was bothered by these uneasy feelings. I couldn't explain why I was sweating when the night air was so cold. I stopped dead in my tracks upon hearing a sound I couldn't identify. I had a strong hunch that eyes were watching me, eyes belonging to a creature lurking in the shadows of the overgrown areas. Still, I refused to give in to fear. I picked up my pace and walked faster. Behind me, I heard a series of rustling noises matching each of my hurried steps. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, then to both sides, and back in front of me again. By chance, when I looked behind me, I saw a large black dog growling, drool dripping from its mouth as if it were ravenous. I didn't have a torch or anything at that moment, but luckily the moon was very bright, allowing me to see the road. I sprinted away from that big black dog, my heart pounding so hard from fear. In just a few seconds, that swift creature caught up to me, tackling me from behind, causing me to fall face first to the ground. The weight of that dog's paws was tremendous, leaving long scratches on my back. I distinctly felt its sharp, lengthy claws digging into my shoulder. I was terrified, certain that this was the end for me. But it turned out the dog was really after the pork I was carrying. It snatched the plastic bag of meat I held, then bolted away. "That's for our festival meal. Give it back, you beast," I suddenly shouted, my fear replaced by anger at what I assumed was just a regular dog. Honestly, I was more scared of my mum's reaction if I showed up empty-handed at home. I got to my feet, grabbed a pointed stick, and chased after the dog. I picked up any rock or branch I could find and hurled them at the animal. After a short while, I paused because the dog had also stopped running. Holding the bag of meat in its jaws, it turned to look at me. The dog's expression grew even fiercer, clearly enraged by the stones I had thrown earlier. The plastic bag of pork dropped to the ground as the dog let it fall from its mouth. It snarled, baring its teeth, and charged straight at me. I braced myself, planting my feet so I wouldn't get knocked over, angling my body in case it lunged. When the dog reached me, it jumped, and I managed to thrust the pointed stick into its side. The creature howled in pain, then limped away. Even so, it grabbed the plastic-wrapped meat again. I knew it was growing weak, so I followed it. It couldn't get far. I watched it enter a derelict house. Carefully, I approached, trying to spot the dog, but it was nowhere to be found. What I did see inside that abandoned house was a frail old man clutching his stomach. Next to him lay the bag of meat I had bought at the butcher. I was immediately puzzled and scanned the area, looking for the dog, but I couldn't spot it anywhere. It crossed my mind that maybe this old man and the black dog were one and the same. Then again, that seemed impossible. Unless, of course, the old man was some kind of shape-shifting creature. "I saw the dog jump out the window, kid," the old man said. "It had some meat with it, so I tried to chase it off. I didn't have anything to eat. I managed to get the meat, but the dog got away. Maybe it got scared." He spoke in a weak voice and smiled. Something about him made me feel sorry for him. I hadn't realized anyone was still living in that run-down building. The old man asked if I could share some meat with him, but I refused, as I had only bought just enough for us. If I gave him any, there wouldn't be enough to feed the guests visiting our home for the festival. After retrieving my meat, I quickly said goodbye and headed home. I ran most of the way so I could return sooner. When I arrived, Mom was waiting anxiously at our door, worried because I had been gone so long. That night, we cooked just enough meat for a meal and boiled the rest to prepare the next day during the festival itself. "We have so little food for tomorrow's gathering," I joked to Dad. "Maybe we can cook your prized roosters instead." He scolded me for suggesting it. He believed it would bring bad luck in his next cockfight if he served his roosters as a meal. Still, we all ended up laughing and chatting through dinner. After we ate, I went to bed early, too excited for the next day. Festivals around here mean dancing in the town square, houses overflowing with dishes. Even if ours was minimal, I still felt the thrill. The sun rose and the morning kicked off with a lively parade. I woke up at dawn thanks to all the noise. I walked around the town square, noticing the many vendors selling sweets and other items. Some booths sold various trinkets, which they claimed could ward off evil or protect against dark beings. Since I don't really believe in things like that, I paid them no mind. Instead, I was amused by the rabbit and colorful chick vendors nearby. There were also street magicians performing illusions for the crowd. I house-hopped to sample food from neighbors who were hosting visitors. Worn out from all the walking, I eventually went home to help Mom finish cooking. I felt slightly sad that we had no visitors of our own. Other homes were filled with guests, lots of kids too, but at our place I had no one to play with. Nonetheless, I was still grateful to spend time with my parents. I told them I planned to head back to the town square once night fell, as the real festivities would begin then. Mom and Dad agreed, so after lunch, I decided to take a nap to prepare for an evening of fun. When I woke up, it was already nighttime. I was surprised Mom and Dad hadn't awakened me sooner. Without changing clothes, I hurriedly asked their permission to go out again. I grabbed a flashlight and took off toward the square. There I found people dancing, the music booming, and a lot of kids running around. I joined in their games, chasing each other in the crowd. Before long, I collided with an old man, knocking him to the ground. I panicked when I realized what I'd done. I quickly helped him up and apologized. Then I recognized him. It was the same old man who had helped me get my meat back from that dog the previous night. "Oh, it's you. What brought you here to our town festival?" I asked. He smirked, tapped my shoulder and answered, "Well, kid, I'm hungry and have no food back where I stay, so I came here when I heard it was festival time." Lots of feasts going on. His eyes narrowed in a strange way. I found it odd, but chalked it up to his old age and feeble voice making him hard to understand. Among all the people there, he was the only one I truly did not know. Most who attended were from nearby neighborhoods, but this man I had only met the day before. He'd mentioned he was homeless, just drifting around with no permanent residence. I assumed I'd just happened to catch him squatting in that abandoned house. "Have you eaten yet?" I asked. "Yes, but it wasn't enough. I'm still hungry," he replied. So I decided to bring him to our home, given that we had no guests anyway. He immediately agreed without hesitation. It worked out since our place was quiet. We had no visitors. I left my friends behind and guided him on foot, helping him walk. At one point, I accidentally touched his side, and he suddenly shouted, growling like a feral dog. He shoved me so hard that I fell onto the grass. I had no idea this old man had such strength. My heart pounded at his aggressive response, and I couldn't help but wonder what was going on with his stomach area. Moments later, though, he apologized, so I smiled and continued helping him along the way. As we walked, we passed people who said they were searching for their missing children. Others were looking for a missing male relative. I figured their loved ones were probably just dancing at the festival, so I didn't pay much attention. Meanwhile, the old man kept his head down, as if avoiding eye contact with everyone we passed. After a while, we finally reached my house. My mum was standing at the door, asking me who was with me. I explained that he was a kind acquaintance in need of a meal. Since our family is compassionate by nature, my parents invited him in right away and served him some food. "Apologies for the small portions," I said. "This is all the pork I bought yesterday." He just smiled at me in return. He devoured the food, but soon began vomiting everything up. He complained of feeling ill and then passed out. We had no idea why this happened. Mum and Dad panicked, discussing whether to call someone from the local community office, but the old man regained consciousness before we could. That was when he explained that his body couldn't handle foods that included certain seasonings, things like garlic. We apologized for causing him harm by offering him food that made him sick. We decided it would be best for him to rest in our home for a while. He wanted to leave, but we insisted he stay, worried some drunken people might harass him if he wandered outside at night. Later that evening, Dad said he was going out for some drinks with his buddies, so Mom and I were left in the house with the old man, who was sleeping in the bedroom. I set up some bedding in the living room floor to sleep there with Mom. As the night wore on, I was awakened by the sudden cawing of our chickens out back. Their clucks and cries were so strange that I shot upright. I tiptoed to our window to peek outside, but Mum stopped me. She had woken up too and grabbed my shirt. She thought I might be sneaking off to the dance again, but I told her that wasn't my plan. I just noticed the unusual noise from our chickens. We both listened closely to our surroundings. The moment we sensed something strange, we were filled with dread. Mum cracked open the window and was shocked at what she saw. She told me there was a big black dog outside. Not quite believing her, I decided to peek myself. I caught a glimpse of something unusual, but I couldn't be certain if it was a large dog because of the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it outside. I nearly fell backward when the light revealed the shape of a giant dog morphing into the form of an old man. He turned to look in our direction, gripping a dead chicken still tied to our fence, blood dripping from his mouth. Mum quickly slammed the window shut and made sure it was locked. We hurried to the bedroom to see if the old man was still there, but he was gone, confirming that the creature outside must be the same old man we'd sheltered. Mum rushed to close the bedroom's open window. We believed he must have left that way, but before she could secure it, a hairy arm appeared, grabbing her by the wrist. She let out a scream as he dragged her toward the window. I ran over and pulled her free. We felt that no matter what we did, this shapeshifter wouldn't leave us alone. We heard it circling the house as if looking for an opening, banging against the doors, growling with that same canine snarl. Eventually, everything went quiet, and we relaxed for a split second, until a loud thud struck our window, over and over, as though the creature was forcing it open. Soon the entire house was shaking. We heard massive footsteps stomping around our bedroom, and we realized it had broken in. Mum told me to stay behind her. She was trying to shield me from the monster lunging at us. She held a kitchen knife, pointing it in the creature's direction, but I could see her arm trembling with fear. Suddenly, the shapeshifter leapt straight at us. I dashed behind our tall cabinet, while Mom tried to slip beneath its lunge, causing the knife to fly from her hand. She threw all her strength at it, but the creature was far stronger. Its teeth nearly closed around her neck. In a moment of sheer courage, I grabbed the fallen knife and plunged it into the back of the creature's neck. It roared in pain and turned on me instead. It struck me with incredible force, sending me crashing into the wall. It was about to finish me off when, to my relief, Dad kicked our door open and rushed inside, stabbing the shapeshifter again and again. The monster weakened, unable to escape, and before long, it drew its final breath. In the moments that followed, when it reverted to the shape of an old man, I could see the gash in his stomach, confirming that he and the huge dog were one and the same. The news spread quickly throughout our neighborhood in rural Nebraska and even reached the nearby towns. The next morning, several lifeless bodies were found dismembered, suspected victims of the aswang my dad had slain. Those corpses belonged to the people who had gone missing during the festival. Everyone was horrified by the gruesome events that took place in our community. Ever since then, whenever we hold another town festival here, I've become more cautious about interacting with strangers. That's the end of my story. Once again, this was Mr. Horror. I'll see you again soon in the next horror story.